A child is being beaten. A contribution to the study of the origin of sexual perversions. 1. It is surprising how often people who seek analytic treatment for hysteria or an obsessional neurosis confess to having indulged in the fantasy, a child is being beaten. Very probably there are still more frequent instances of it among the far greater number of people who have not been obliged to come to analysis by manifest illness. The fantasy has feelings of pleasure attached to it, and on their account the patient has reproduced it on innumerable occasions in the past or may even still be doing so. At the climax of the imaginary situation there is almost invariably a masturbatory satisfaction carried out, that is to say, on the genitals. At first this takes place voluntarily, but later on it does so in spite of the patient's efforts, and with the characteristics of an obsession. It is only with hesitation that this fantasy is confessed to. Its first appearance is recollected with uncertainty. The analytic treatment of the topic is met by unmistakable resistance. Shame and a sense of guilt are perhaps more strongly excited in this connection than when similar accounts are given of memories of the beginning of sexual life. Eventually it becomes possible to establish that the first fantasies of the kind were entertained very early in life, certainly before school age, and not later than in the 5th or 6th year. When the child was at school and saw other children being beaten by the teacher, then, if the fantasies had become dormant, this experience called them up again, or, if they were still present, it reinforced them and noticeably modified their content. From that time forward it was an indefinite number of children that were being beaten. The influence of the school was so clear that the patients concerned were at first tempted to trace back their beating fantasies exclusively to these impressions of school life, which dated from later than their 6th year. But it was never possible for them to maintain that position, the fantasies had already been in existence before. Though in the higher forms at school the children were no longer beaten, the influence of such occasions was replaced and more than replaced by the effects of reading, of which the importance was soon to be felt. In my patient's milieu it was almost always the same books whose contents gave a new stimulus to the beating fantasies, those accessible to young people, such as what was known as the Bibliothèque Rose, Uncle Tom's Cabin, etc. The child began to compete with these works of fiction by producing his own fantasies and by constructing a wealth of situations and institutions, in which children were beaten, or were punished and disciplined in some other way, because of their naughtiness and bad behavior. This fantasy a child is being beaten was invariably connected with a high degree of pleasure and had its issue in an act of pleasurable autoerotic satisfaction. It might therefore be expected that the sight of another child being beaten at school would also be a source of similar enjoyment. But as a matter of fact this was never so. The experience of real scenes of beating at school produced in the child who witnessed them a peculiarly excited feeling which was probably of a mixed character and in which repugnance had a large share. In a few cases the real experience of the scenes of beating was felt to be intolerable. Moreover, it was always a condition of the more sophisticated fantasies of later years that the punishment should do the children no serious injury. The question was bound to arise of what relation there might be between the importance of the beating fantasies and the part that real corporal punishment might have played in the child's bringing up at home. It was impossible, on account of the one-sidedness of the material, to confirm the first suspicion that the relation was an inverse one. The individuals from whom the data for these analyses were derived very seldom beaten in their childhood, or were at all events not brought up by the help of the rod. Naturally, however, each of these children was bound to have become aware at one time or another of the superior physical strength of its parents or educators. The fact that in every nursery the children themselves at times come to blows requires no special emphasis. As regards the early and simple fantasies which could not be obviously traced to the influence of school impressions or of scenes taken from books, further information would have been welcome. Who was the child that was being beaten? The one who was himself producing the fantasy or another? Was it always the same child or as often as not a different one? Who was it that was beating the child? A grown-up person? And if so, who? Or did the child imagine that he himself was beating another one? Nothing could be ascertained that threw any light upon all these questions, only the hesitant reply, I know nothing more about it, a child is being beaten. Inquiries as to the sex of the child that was being beaten met with more success, but nonetheless brought no enlightenment. Sometimes the answer was, always boys, or only girls, more often it was, I don't know, or it doesn't matter which. But the point to which the questions were directed, the discovery of some constant relation between the sex of the child producing the fantasy and that of the child that was being beaten, was never established. Now and again another characteristic detail of the content of the fantasy came to light, a small child is being beaten on its naked bottom. In these circumstances it was impossible at first even to decide whether the pleasure attaching to the beating fantasy was to be described as sadistic or masochistic. 2. A fantasy of this kind, arising, perhaps from accidental causes, in early childhood and retained for the purpose of autoerotic satisfaction, can, in the light of our present knowledge, only be regarded as a primary trait of perversion. One of the components of the sexual function has, it seems, developed in advance of the rest, has made itself prematurely independent, has undergone fixation and in consequence been withdrawn from the later processes of development, and has in this way given evidence of a peculiar and abnormal constitution in the individual. We know that an infantile perversion of this sort need not persist for a whole lifetime, later on it can be subjected to repression, be replaced by reaction formation, or be transformed by sublimation. It is possible that sublimation arises out of some special process, which would be held back by repression. But if these processes do not take place, then the perversion persists to maturity, and whenever we find a sexual aberration in adults' perversion, fetishism, inversion, we are justified in expecting that anamnestic investigation will reveal an event such as I have suggested, leading to a fixation in childhood. Indeed, long before the days of psychoanalysis, observers like Binet were able to trace the strange sexual aberrations of maturity back to similar impressions and to precisely the same period of childhood, namely, the 5th or 6th year. Point 2. But at this point the inquirer was confronted with the limitations of our knowledge, for the impressions that brought about the fixation were without any traumatic force. They were for the most part commonplace and unexciting to other people. It was impossible to say why the sexual impulse had undergone fixation particularly upon them. It was possible, however, to look for their significance in the fact that they offered an occasion for fixation, even though it was an accidental one, to precisely that component which was prematurely developed and ready to press forward. We had in any case to be prepared to come to a provisional end somewhere or other in tracing back the train of causal connection, and the congenital constitution seemed exactly to correspond with what was required for a stopping place of that kind. If the sexual component which has broken loose prematurely is the sadistic one, then we may expect, on the basis of knowledge derived from other sources, that its subsequent repression will result in a disposition to an obsessional neurosis. Point 3. This expectation cannot be said to be contradicted by the results of inquiry. The present short paper is based on the exhaustive study of 6 cases, 4 female and 2 male. Of these, 2 were cases of obsessional neurosis, one extremely severe and incapacitating, the other of moderate severity and quite well accessible to influence. There was also a third case which at all events exhibited clearly marked individual traits of obsessional neurosis. The fourth case, it must be admitted, was one of straightforward hysteria, with pains and inhibitions, and the fifth patient, who had come to be analyzed merely on account of indecisiveness in life, would not have been classified at all by coarse clinical diagnosis, or would have been dismissed as psychasthenic. Point 1. There is no need for feeling disappointed over these statistics. In the first place, we know that not every disposition is necessarily developed into a disorder. In the second place, we ought to be content to explain the facts before us, and not as a rule to avoid the additional task of making it clear why something has not taken place. The present state of our knowledge would allow us to make our way so far and no further towards the comprehension of beating fantasies. In the mind of the analytic physician, it is true, there remains an uneasy suspicion that this is not a final solution of the problem. He is obliged to admit to himself that to a great extent these fantasies subsist apart from the rest of the content of a neurosis, and find no proper place in its structure. But impressions of this kind, as I know from my own experience, are only too willingly put on one side. 3. Strictly considered, and why should this question not be considered with all possible strictness, analytic work deserves to be recognized as genuine psychoanalysis only when it has succeeded in removing the amnesia which conceals from the adult his knowledge of his childhood from its beginning, that is, from about the 2nd to the 5th year. This cannot be said among analysts too emphatically or repeated too often. The motives for disregarding this reminder are, indeed, intelligible. It would be desirable to obtain practical results in a shorter period and with less trouble. But at the present time theoretical knowledge is still far more important to all of us than therapeutic success, and anyone who neglects childhood analysis is bound to fall into the most disastrous errors. The emphasis which is laid here upon the importance of the earliest experiences does not imply any underestimation of the influence of later ones. But the later impressions of life speak loudly enough through the mouth of the patient, while it is the physician who has to raise his voice on behalf of the claims of childhood. It is in the years of childhood between the ages of 2 and 4 or 5 that the congenital libidinal factors are first awakened by actual experiences and become attached to certain complexes. The beating fantasies which are now under discussion show themselves only towards the end of this period or after its termination. So it may quite well be that they have an earlier history, that they go through a process of development, that they represent an end product and not an initial manifestation. This suspicion is confirmed by analysis. A systematic application of it shows that beating fantasies have a historical development which is by no means simple, and in the course of which they are changed in most respects more than once as regards their relation to the author of the fantasy, and as regards their object, their content, and their significance. In order to make it easier to follow these transformations in beating fantasies, I shall now venture to confine my descriptions to the female cases, which, since they are 4 as against 2, in any case constitute the greater part of my material. Moreover, beating fantasies in men are connected with another subject, which I shall leave on one side in this paper. Point 1. In my description I shall be careful to avoid being more schematic than is inevitable for the presentation of an average case. If then on further observation the greater complexity of circumstances should come to light, I shall nevertheless be sure of having before us a typical occurrence, and 1. Moreover, that is not of an uncommon kind. The first phase of beating fantasies among girls, then, must belong to a very early period of childhood. Some features remain curiously indefinite, as though they were a matter of indifference. The scanty information given by the patients in their first statement, "A child is being beaten," seems to be justified in respect to this phase. But another of their features can be established with certainty, and to the same effect in every case. The child being beaten is never the one producing the fantasy, but is invariably another child, most often a brother or a sister if there is any. Since this other child may be a boy or a girl, there is no constant relation between the sex of the child producing the fantasy and that of the child being beaten. The fantasy, then, is certainly not masochistic. It would be tempting to call it sadistic, but one cannot neglect the fact that the child producing the fantasy is never doing the beating herself. The actual identity of the person who does the beating remains obscure at first. Only this much can be established: it is not a child but an adult. Later on this indeterminate grown-up person becomes recognizable clearly and unambiguously as the girl's father. This first phase of the beating fantasy is therefore completely represented by the phrase, "My father is beating the child." I am betraying a great deal of what is to be brought forward later when instead of this I say, "My father is beating the child whom I hate." Moreover, one may hesitate to say whether the characteristics of a fantasy can yet be ascribed to this first step towards the later beating fantasy. It is perhaps rather a question of recollections of events which have been witnessed, or of desires which have arisen on various occasions. But these doubts are of no importance. Profound transformations have taken place between this first phase and the next. It is true that the person beating remains the same, that is, the father, but the child who is beaten has been changed into another one and is now invariably the child producing the fantasy. The fantasy is accompanied by a high degree of pleasure, and has now acquired a significant content, with the origin of which we shall be concerned later. Now, therefore, the wording runs, "I am being beaten by my father." It is of an unmistakably masochistic character. This second phase is the most important and the most momentous of all. But we may say of it in a certain sense that it has never had a real existence. It is never remembered, it has never succeeded in becoming conscious. It is a construction of analysis, but it is no less a necessity on that account. The third phase once more resembles the first. It has the wording which is familiar to us from the patient's statement. The person beating is never the father, but is either left undetermined just as in the first phase, or turns in a characteristic way into a representative of the father, such as a teacher. The figure of the child who is producing the beating fantasy no longer itself appears in it. In reply to pressing inquiries the patients only declare, "I am probably looking on." Instead of the one child that is being beaten, there are now a number of children present as a rule. Most frequently it is boys who are being beaten, in girls' fantasies, but none of them is personally known to the subject. The situation of being beaten, which was originally simple and monotonous, may go through the most complicated alterations and elaborations, and punishments and humiliations of another kind may be substituted for the beating itself. But the essential characteristic which distinguishes even the simplest fantasies of this phase from those of the first, and which establishes the connection with the intermediate phase, is this: the fantasy now has strong and unambiguous sexual excitement attached to it, and so provides a means for masturbatory satisfaction. But this is precisely what is puzzling. By what path has the fantasy of strange and unknown boys being beaten, a fantasy which has by this time become sadistic, found its way into the permanent possession of the little girl's libidinal trends? Nor can we conceal from ourselves that the interrelations and sequence of the 3 phases of the beating fantasy, as well as all its other peculiarities, have so far remained quite unintelligible. 4. If the analysis is carried through the early period to which the beating fantasies are referred and from which they are recollected, it shows us the child involved in the agitations of its parental complex. The affections of the little girl are fixed on her father, who has probably done all he could to win her love, and in this way has sown the seeds of an attitude of hatred and rivalry towards her mother. This attitude exists side by side with the current of affectionate dependence on her, and as years go on it may be destined to come into consciousness more and more clearly and forcibly, or else to give an impetus to an excessive reaction of devotion to her. But it is not with the girl's relation to her mother that the beating fantasy is connected. There are other children in the nursery, only a few years older or younger, who are disliked on all sorts of other grounds, but chiefly because the parents' love has to be shared with them, and for this reason they are repelled with all the wild energy characteristic of the emotional life of those years. If the child in question is a younger brother or sister, as in 3 of my 4 cases, it is despised as well as hated, yet it attracts to itself the share of affection which the blinded parents are always ready to give the youngest child, and this is a spectacle the sight of which cannot be avoided. One soon learns that being beaten, even if it does not hurt very much, signifies a deprivation of love and a humiliation. And many children who believe themselves securely enthroned in the unshakable affection of their parents have by a single blow been cast down from all the heavens of their imaginary omnipotence. The idea of the father beating this hateful child is therefore an agreeable one, quite apart from whether he has actually been seen doing so. It means, my father does not love this other child, he loves only me. This then is the content and meaning of the beating fantasy in its first phase. The fantasy obviously gratifies the child's jealousy and is dependent upon the erotic side of its life, but is also powerfully reinforced by the child's egoistic interests. Doubt remains, therefore, whether the fantasy ought to be described as purely sexual, nor can one venture to call it sadistic. As is well known, all the signs on which we are accustomed to base our distinctions tend to lose their clarity as we come nearer to the source. So perhaps we may say in terms recalling the prophecy made by the 3 witches to Banquo, not clearly sexual, not in itself sadistic, but yet the stuff from which both will later come. In any case, however, there is no ground for suspecting that in this first phase the fantasy is already at the service of an excitation which involves the genitals and finds its outlet in a masturbatory act. It is clear that the child's sexual life has reached the stage of genital organization, now that its incestuous love has achieved this premature choice of an object. This can be demonstrated more easily in the case of boys, but is also indisputable in the case of girls. Something like a premonition of what are later to be the final and normal sexual aims governs the child's libidinal trends. We may justly wonder why this should be so, but we may regard it as a proof of the fact that the genitals have already begun playing their part in the process of excitation. With boys the wish to beget a child from their mother is never absent, with girls the wish to have a child by their father is equally constant, and this in spite of their being completely incapable of forming any clear idea of the means for fulfilling these wishes. The child seems to be convinced that the genitals have something to do with the matter, even though in its constant brooding it may look for the essence of the presumed intimacy between its parents in relations of another sort, such as in their sleeping together, micturating in each other's presence, etc., and material of the latter kind can be more easily apprehended in verbal images than the mystery that is connected with the genitals. But the time comes when this early blossoming is nipped by the frost. None of these incestuous loves can avoid the fate of repression. They may succumb to it on the occasion of some discoverable external event which leads to disillusionment such as unexpected slights, the unwelcome birth of a new brother or sister, which is felt as faithlessness, etc., or the same thing may happen owing to internal conditions apart from any such events, perhaps simply because their yearning remains unsatisfied too long. It is unquestionably true that such events are not the effective causes, but that these love affairs are bound to come to grief sooner or later, though we cannot say on what particular stumbling block. Most probably they pass away because their time is over, because the children have entered upon a new phase of development in which they are compelled to recapitulate from the history of mankind the repression of an incestuous object choice, just as at an earlier stage they were obliged to effect an object choice of that very sort. Point 1 in the new phase, no mental product of the incestuous love impulses that is present unconsciously is taken over by consciousness, and anything that has already come into consciousness is expelled from it. At the same time as this process of repression takes place, a sense of guilt appears. This is also of unknown origin, but there is no doubt whatever that it is connected with the incestuous wishes, and that it is justified by the persistence of those wishes in the unconscious. Point 2. The fantasy of the period of incestuous love had said, he, my father, loves only me, and not the other child, for he is beating it. The sense of guilt can discover no punishment more severe than the reversal of this triumph. No, he does not love you, for he is beating you. In this way the fantasy of the second phase, that of being beaten by her father, is a direct expression of the girl's sense of guilt, to which her love for her father has now succumbed. The fantasy, therefore, has become masochistic. So far as I know, this is always so. A sense of guilt is invariably the factor that transforms sadism into masochism. But this is certainly not the whole content of masochism. The sense of guilt cannot have won the field alone, a share must also fall to the love impulse. We must remember that we are dealing with children in whom the sadistic component was able for constitutional reasons to develop prematurely and in isolation. We need not abandon this point of view. It is precisely such children who find it particularly easy to hark back to the pregenital, sadistic anal organization of their sexual life. If the genital organization, when it has scarcely been affected, is met by repression, the result is not only that every psychical representation of the incestuous love becomes unconscious, or remains so, but there is another result as well, a regressive debasement of the genital organization itself to a lower level. My father loves me was meant in a genital sense, owing to the regression it is turned into my father is beating me, I am being beaten by my father. This being beaten is now a convergence of the sense of guilt and sexual love. It is not only the punishment for the forbidden genital relation, but also the regressive substitute for that relation, and from this latter source it derives the libidinal excitation which is from this time forward attached to it, and which finds its outlet in masturbatory acts. Here for the first time we have the essence of masochism. This second phase, the child's fantasy of being itself beaten by its father, remains unconscious as a rule, probably in consequence of the intensity of the repression. I cannot explain why nevertheless in one of my 6 cases, that of a male, it was consciously remembered. This man, now grown up, had preserved the fact clearly in his memory that he used to employ the idea of being beaten by his mother for the purpose of masturbation, though to be sure he soon substituted for his own mother the mothers of his schoolfellows or other women who in some way resembled her. It must not be forgotten that when a boy's incestuous fantasy is transformed into the corresponding masochistic one more reversal has to take place than in the case of the girl, namely the substitution of passivity for activity, and this additional degree of distortion may save the fantasy from having to remain unconscious as a result of repression. In this way the sense of guilt would be satisfied by regression instead of by repression. In the female cases, the sense of guilt, in itself perhaps more exacting, could be appeased only by a combination of the two. In 2 of my 4 female cases, an elaborate superstructure of daydreams, which was of great significance for the life of the person concerned, had grown up over the masochistic beating fantasy. The function of the superstructure was to make possible a feeling of satisfied excitation, even though the masturbatory act was abstained from. In one of these cases, the content being beaten by the father was allowed to venture again into consciousness, so long as the subject's own ego was made unrecognizable by a thin disguise. The hero of these stories was invariably beaten, or later only punished, humiliated, etc., by his father. I repeat, however, that as a rule the fantasy remains unconscious, and can only be reconstructed in the course of the analysis. This fact perhaps vindicates patients who say they remember that the masturbation made its appearance before the third phase of the beating fantasy, shortly to be discussed, and that this phase was only a later addition, made perhaps under the impression of scenes at school. Every time I have given credit to these statements, I have felt inclined to assume that the masturbation was at first under the dominance of unconscious fantasies and that conscious ones were substituted for them later. I look upon the beating fantasy in its familiar third phase, which is its final form, as a substitute of this sort. Here the child who produces the fantasy appears almost as a spectator, while the father persists in the shape of a teacher or some other person in authority. The fantasy, which now resembles that of the first phase, seems to have become sadistic once more. It appears as though in the phrase, "My father is beating the child, he loves only me," the stress has been shifted back onto the first part after the second part has undergone repression. But only the form of this fantasy is sadistic, the satisfaction which is derived from it is masochistic. Its significance lies in the fact that it has taken over the libidinal cathexis of the repressed portion and at the same time the sense of guilt which is attached to the content of that portion. All of the many unspecified children who are being beaten by the teacher are, after all, nothing more than substitutes for the child itself. We find here for the first time, too, something like a constancy of sex in the persons who play a part in the fantasy. The children who are being beaten are almost invariably boys, in the fantasies of boys just as much as in those of girls. This characteristic is naturally not to be explained by any rivalry between the sexes, as otherwise of course in the fantasies of boys it would be girls who would be being beaten, and it has nothing to do with the sex of the child who was hated in the first phase. But it points to a complication in the case of girls. When they turn away from their incestuous love for their father, with its genital significance, they easily abandon their feminine role. They spur their masculinity complex, Van Ophuijsen, 1917, into activity, and from that time forward only want to be boys. For that reason the whipping boys who represent them are boys too. In both the cases of daydreaming, one of which almost rose to the level of a work of art, the heroes were always young men, indeed women used not to come into these creations at all, and only made their first appearance after many years, and then in minor parts. 5. I hope I have brought forward my analytic observations in sufficient detail, and I should only like to add that the 6 cases I have mentioned so often do not exhaust my material. Like other analysts, I have at my disposal a far larger number of cases which have been investigated less thoroughly. These observations can be made use of along various lines, for elucidating the genesis of the perversions in general and of masochism in particular, and for estimating the part played by difference of sex in the dynamics of neurosis. The most obvious result of such a discussion is its application to the origin of the perversions. The view which brought into the foreground in this connection the constitutional reinforcement or premature growth of a single sexual component is not shaken, indeed, but it is seen not to comprise the whole truth. The perversion is no longer an isolated fact in the child's sexual life, but falls into its place among the typical, not to say normal, processes of development which are familiar to us. It is brought into relation with the child's incestuous love object, with its Oedipus complex. It first comes into prominence in the sphere of this complex, and after the complex has broken down it remains over, often quite by itself, the inheritor of the charge of libido from that complex and weighed down by the sense of guilt that was attached to it. The abnormal sexual constitution, finally, has shown its strength by forcing the Oedipus complex into a particular direction, and by compelling it to leave an unusual residue behind. A perversion in childhood, as is well known, may become the basis for the construction of a perversion having a similar sense and persisting throughout life, one which consumes the subject's whole sexual life. On the other hand, the perversion may be broken off and remain in the background of a normal sexual development, from which, however, it continues to withdraw a certain amount of energy. The first of these alternatives was already known before the days of analysis. Analytic investigation, however, of such fully developed cases almost bridges the gulf between the two. For we find often enough with these perverts that they too made an attempt at developing normal sexual activity, usually at the age of puberty, but their attempt had not enough force in it and was abandoned in the face of the first obstacles which inevitably arise, whereupon they fell back upon their infantile fixation once and for all. It would naturally be important to know whether the origin of infantile perversions from the Oedipus complex can be asserted as a general principle. While this cannot be decided without further investigation, it does not seem impossible. When we recall the anamnesis which have been obtained in adult cases of perversion, we cannot fail to notice that the decisive impression, the first experience, of all these perverts, fetishists, etc., is scarcely ever referred back to a time earlier than the 6th year. At this time, however, the dominance of the Oedipus complex is already over. The experience which is recalled, and which has been effective in such a puzzling way, may very well have represented the legacy of that complex. The connections between the experience and the complex which is by this time repressed are bound to remain obscure so long as analysis has not thrown any light on the time before the first pathogenic impression. So it may be imagined how little value is to be attached, for instance, to an assertion that a case of homosexuality is congenital, when the ground given for this belief is that ever since his 8th or 6th year the person in question has felt inclinations only towards his own sex. If, however, the derivation of perversions from the Oedipus complex can be generally established, our estimate of its importance will have gained added strength. For in our opinion the Oedipus complex is the actual nucleus of neuroses, and the infantile sexuality which culminates in this complex is the true determinant of neuroses. What remains of the complex in the unconscious represents the disposition to the later development of neuroses in the adult. In this way the beating fantasy and other analogous perverse fixations would also only be precipitates of the Oedipus complex, scars, so to say, left behind after the process has ended, just as the notorious sense of inferiority corresponds to a narcissistic scar of the same sort. In taking this view of the matter I must express my unreserved agreement with Marcinowski, 1918, who has recently put it forward most happily. As is well known, this neurotic delusion of inferiority is only a partial one, and is completely compatible with the existence of a self-overvaluation derived from other sources. The origin of the Oedipus complex itself, and the destiny which compels man, probably alone among all animals, to begin his sexual life twice over, first like all other creatures in his early childhood, and then after a long interruption once more at the age of puberty. All the problems that are connected with man's archaic heritage have been discussed by me elsewhere, and I have no intention of going into them in this place. Point 1. Little light is thrown upon the genesis of masochism by our discussion of the beating fantasy. To begin with, there seems to be a confirmation of the view that masochism is not the manifestation of a primary instinct, but originates from sadism which has been turned around upon the self, that is to say, by means of regression from an object to the ego. Point 1. Instincts with a passive aim must be taken for granted as existing, especially among women. But passivity is not the whole of masochism. The characteristic of unpleasure belongs to it as well, a bewildering accompaniment to the satisfaction of an instinct. The transformation of sadism into masochism appears to be due to the influence of the sense of guilt which takes part in the act of repression. Thus repression is operative here in three ways. It renders the consequences of the genital organization unconscious, it compels that organization itself to regress to the earlier sadistic anal stage, and it transforms the sadism of this stage into masochism, which is passive and again in a certain sense narcissistic. The second of these three effects is made possible by the weakness of the genital organization, which must be presupposed in these cases. The third becomes necessary because the sense of guilt takes as much objection to sadism as to incestuous object choice genitally conceived. Again, the analyses do not tell us the origin of the sense of guilt itself. It seems to be brought along by the new phase upon which the child is entering, and, if it afterwards persists, it seems to correspond to a scar-like formation which is similar to the sense of inferiority. According to our present orientation in the structure of the ego, which is as yet uncertain, we should assign it to the agency in the mind which sets itself up as a critical conscience over against the rest of the ego, which produces Silber's functional phenomenon in dreams, and which cuts itself loose from the ego in delusions of being watched. Point 2. We may note too in passing that the analysis of the infantile perversion dealt with here is also of help in solving an old riddle, one which, it is true, has always troubled those who have not accepted psychoanalysis more than analysts themselves. Yet quite recently even Bleuler regarded it as a remarkable and inexplicable fact that neurotics make masturbation the central point of their sense of guilt. We have long assumed that the sense of guilt relates to the masturbation of early childhood and not to that of puberty, and that in the main it is to be connected not with the act of masturbation but with the fantasy which, although unconscious, lies at its root, that is to say, with the Oedipus complex. Point 1. As regards the third and apparently sadistic phase of the beating fantasy, I have already pages 190 to 1 discussed the significance that it gains as the vehicle of the excitation impelling towards masturbation, and I have shown how it arouses activities of the imagination which on the one hand continue the fantasy along the same line, and on the other hand neutralize it through compensation. Nevertheless, the second phase, the unconscious and masochistic one, in which the child itself is being beaten by its father, is incomparably the more important. This is not only because it continues to operate through the agency of the phase that takes its place, we can also detect effects upon the character, which are directly derived from its unconscious form. People who harbor fantasies of this kind develop a special sensitiveness and irritability towards anyone whom they can include in the class of fathers. They are easily offended by a person of this kind, and in that way, to their own sorrow and cost, bring about the realization of the imagined situation of being beaten by their father. I should not be surprised if it were one day possible to prove that the same fantasy is the basis of the delusional litigiousness of paranoia. 6. It would have been quite impossible to give a clear survey of infantile beating fantasies if I had not limited it, except in one or two connections, to the state of things in females. I will briefly recapitulate my conclusions. The little girl's beating fantasy passes through three phases, of which the first and third are consciously remembered, the middle one remaining unconscious. The two conscious phases appear to be sadistic, whereas the middle and unconscious one is undoubtedly of a masochistic nature. Its content consists in the child's being beaten by her father, and it carries with it the libidinal charge and the sense of guilt. In the first and third fantasies, the child who is being beaten is always someone other than the subject. In the middle phase, it is always the child herself. In the third phase, it is almost invariably only boys who are being beaten. The person who does the beating is from the first her father, replaced later on by a substitute taken from the class of fathers. The unconscious fantasy of the middle phase had primarily a genital significance and developed by means of repression and regression out of an incestuous wish to be loved by the father. Another fact, though its connection with the rest does not appear to be close, is that between the second and third phases the girls change their sex, for in the fantasies of the latter phase they turn into boys. I have not been able to get so far in my knowledge of beating fantasies in boys, perhaps because my material was unfavorable. I naturally expected to find a complete analogy between the state of things in the case of boys and in that of girls, the mother taking the father's place in the fantasy. This expectation seemed to be fulfilled, for the content of the boy's fantasy which was taken to be the corresponding one was actually as being beaten by his mother, or later on by a substitute for her. But this fantasy, in which the boy's own self was retained as the person who was being beaten, differed from the second phase in girls in that it was able to become conscious. If on this account, however, we attempt to draw a parallel between it and the third phase of the girl's fantasy, a new difference is found, for the figure of the boy himself is not replaced by a number of unknown and unspecified children, least of all by a number of girls. Therefore the expectation of there being a complete parallel was mistaken. My male cases with an infantile beating fantasy comprised only a few who did not exhibit some other gross injury to their sexual activities. Again, they included a fairly large number of persons who would have to be described as true masochists in the sense of being sexual perverts. They were either people who obtained their sexual satisfaction exclusively from masturbation accompanied by masochistic fantasies, or they were people who had succeeded in combining masochism with their genital activity in such a way that, along with masochistic performances and under similar conditions, they were able to bring about erection and emission or to carry out normal intercourse. In addition to this, there was the rarer case in which a masochist is interfered with in his perverse activities by the appearance of obsessional ideas of unbearable intensity. Now, perverts who can obtain satisfaction do not often have occasion to come for analysis. But as regards the three classes of masochists that have been mentioned, there may be strong motives to induce them to go to an analyst. The masochist masturbator finds that he is absolutely impotent if after all he does attempt intercourse with a woman, and the man who has hitherto effected intercourse with the help of a masochistic idea or performance may suddenly make the discovery that the alliance which was so convenient for him has broken down, his genital organs no longer reacting to the masochistic stimulus. We are accustomed confidently to promise recovery to psychically impotent patients who come to us for treatment, but we ought to be more guarded in making this prognosis so long as the dynamics of the disturbance are unknown to us. It comes as a disagreeable surprise if the analysis reveals the cause of the merely psychical impotence to be a typically masochistic attitude, perhaps deeply embedded since infancy. As regards these masochistic men, however, a discovery is made at this point which warns us not to pursue the analogy between their case and that of women any further at present, but to judge each independently. For the fact emerges that in their masochistic fantasies, as well as in the performances they go through for their realization, they invariably transfer themselves into the part of a woman, that is to say, their masochistic attitude coincides with a feminine one. This can easily be demonstrated from details of the fantasies, but many patients are even aware of it themselves, and give expression to it as a subjective conviction. It makes no difference if in a fanciful embellishment of the masochistic scene they keep up the fiction that a mischievous boy, or page, or apprentice is going to be punished. On the other hand, the persons who administer chastisement are always women, both in the fantasies and the performances. This is confusing enough, and the further question must be asked whether this feminine attitude already forms the basis of the masochistic element in the infantile beating fantasy. Let us therefore leave aside consideration of the state of things in cases of adult masochism, which it is so hard to clear up, and turn to the infantile beating fantasy in the male sex. Analysis of the earliest years of childhood once more allows us to make a surprising discovery in this field. The fantasy which has as its content being beaten by the mother, and which is conscious or can become so, is not a primary one. It possesses a preceding stage which is invariably unconscious and has as its content, I am being beaten by my father. This preliminary stage, then, really corresponds to the second phase of the fantasy in the girl. The familiar and conscious fantasy, I am being beaten by my mother, takes the place of the third phase in the girl, in which, as has been mentioned already, unknown boys are the objects that are being beaten. I have not been able to demonstrate among boys a preliminary stage of a sadistic nature that could be set beside the first phase of the fantasy in girls, but I will not now express any final disbelief in its existence, for I can readily see the possibility of meeting with more complicated types. In the male fantasy, as I shall call it briefly, and, I hope, without any risk of being misunderstood, the being beaten also stands for being loved, in a genital sense, though this has been debased to a lower level owing to regression. So the original form of the unconscious male fantasy was not the provisional one that we have hitherto given, I am being beaten by my father, but rather, I am loved by my father. The fantasy has been transformed by the processes with which we are familiar into the conscious fantasy, I am being beaten by my mother. The boy's beating fantasy is therefore passive from the very beginning, and is derived from a feminine attitude towards his father. It corresponds with the Oedipus complex just as the female one, that of the girl, does, only the parallel relation which we expected to find between the two must be given up in favor of a common character of another kind. In both cases the beating fantasy has its origin in an incestuous attachment to the father. Point 1. It will help to make matters clearer if at this point I enumerate the other similarities and differences between beating fantasies in the two sexes. In the case of the girl, the unconscious masochistic fantasy starts from the normal Oedipus attitude, in that of the boy it starts from the inverted attitude, in which the father is taken as the object of love. In the case of the girl, the fantasy has a preliminary stage, the first phase, in which the beating bears no special significance and is performed upon a person who is viewed with jealous hatred. Both of these features are absent in the case of the boy, but this particular difference is one which might be removed by more fortunate observation. In her transition to the conscious fantasy, the third phase which takes the place of the unconscious one, the girl retains the figure of her father, and in that way keeps unchanged the sex of the person beating, but she changes the figure and sex of the person being beaten, so that eventually a man is beating male children. The boy, on the contrary, changes the figure and sex of the person beating, by putting his mother in the place of his father, but he retains his own figure, with the result that the person beating and the person being beaten are of opposite sexes. In the case of the girl, what was originally a masochistic, passive, situation is transformed into a sadistic one by means of repression, and its sexual quality is almost effaced. In the case of the boy, the situation remains masochistic, and shows a greater resemblance to the original fantasy with its genital significance, since there is a difference of sex between the person beating and the person being beaten. The boy evades his homosexuality by repressing and remodeling his unconscious fantasy, and the remarkable thing about his later conscious fantasy is that it has for its content a feminine attitude without a homosexual object choice. By the same process, on the other hand, the girl escapes from the demands of the erotic side of her life altogether. She turns herself in fantasy into a man, without herself becoming active in a masculine way, and is no longer anything but a spectator of the event which takes the place of a sexual act. We are justified in assuming that no great change is effected by the repression of the original unconscious fantasy. Whatever is repressed from consciousness or replaced in it by something else remains intact and potentially operative in the unconscious. The effect of regression to an earlier stage of the sexual organization is quite another matter. As regards this, we are led to believe that the state of things changes in the unconscious as well. Thus in both sexes the masochistic fantasy of being beaten by the father, though not the passive fantasy of being loved by him, lives on in the unconscious after repression has taken place. There are, besides, plenty of indications that the repression has only very incompletely attained its object. The boy, who has tried to escape from a homosexual object choice, and who has not changed his sex, nevertheless feels like a woman in his conscious fantasies, and endows the women who are beating him with masculine attributes and characteristics. The girl, who has even renounced her sex, and who has on the whole accomplished a more thoroughgoing work of repression, nevertheless does not become free from her father. She does not venture to do the beating herself, and since she has herself become a boy, it is principally boys whom she causes to be beaten. I am aware that the differences that I have here described between the two sexes in regard to the nature of the beating fantasy have not been cleared up sufficiently. But I shall not attempt to unravel these complications by tracing out their dependence on other factors, as I do not consider that the material for observation is exhaustive. So far as it goes, however, I should like to make use of it as a test for two theories. These theories stand in opposition to each other, though both of them deal with the relation between repression and sexual character, and each, according to its own view, represents the relation as a very intimate one. I may say at once that I have always regarded both theories as incorrect and misleading. The first of these theories is anonymous. It was brought to my notice many years ago by a colleague with whom I was at that time on friendly terms. Point 1. The theory is so attractive on account of its bold simplicity that the only wonder is that it should not have found its way into the literature of the subject except in a few scattered allusions. It is based on the fact of the bisexual constitution of human beings, and asserts that the motive force of repression in each individual is a struggle between the two sexual characters. The dominant sex of the person, that which is the more strongly developed, has repressed the mental representation of the subordinated sex into the unconscious. Therefore the nucleus of the unconscious, that is to say, the repressed, is in each human being that side of him which belongs to the opposite sex. Such a theory as this can only have an intelligible meaning if we assume that a person's sex is to be determined by the formation of its genitals, for otherwise it would not be certain which is a person stronger sex, and we should run the risk of reaching from the results of our inquiry the very fact which has to serve as its point of departure. To put the theory briefly, with men, what is unconscious and repressed can be brought down to feminine instinctual impulses, and conversely with women. The second theory is of more recent origin, one it is in agreement with the first one insofar as it too represents the struggle between the two sexes as being the decisive cause of repression. In other respects it comes into conflict with the former theory. Moreover, it looks for support to sociological rather than biological sources. According to this theory of the masculine protest, formulated by Alfred Adler, every individual makes efforts not to remain on the inferior feminine line of development and struggles towards the masculine line, from which satisfaction can alone be derived. Adler makes the masculine protest responsible for the whole formation both of character and of neuroses. Unfortunately, he makes so little distinction between the two processes, which certainly have to be kept separate, and sets altogether so little store in general by the fact of repression, that to attempt to apply the doctrine of the masculine protest to repression brings with it the risk of misunderstanding. In my opinion, such an attempt could only lead us to infer that the masculine protest, the desire to break away from the feminine line, was in every case the motive force of repression. The repressing agency, therefore, would always be a masculine instinctual impulse, and the repressed would be a feminine one. But symptoms would also be the result of a feminine impulse, for we cannot discard the characteristic feature of symptoms that they are substitutes for the repressed, substitutes that have made their way out in spite of repression. Now let us take these two theories, which may be said to have in common a sexualization of the process of repression, and test them by applying them to the example of the beating fantasies which we have been studying. The original fantasy, I am being beaten by my father, corresponds, in the case of the boy, to a feminine attitude, and is therefore an expression of that part of his disposition which belongs to the opposite sex. If this part of him undergoes repression, the first theory seems shown to be correct, for this theory set it up as a rule that what belongs to the opposite sex is identical with the repressed. It scarcely answers to our expectations, it is true, when we find that the conscious fantasy, which arises after repression has been accomplished, nevertheless exhibits the feminine attitude once more, though this time directed towards the mother. But we will not go into such doubtful points, when the whole question can be so quickly decided. There can be no doubt that the original fantasy in the case of the girl, I am being beaten, i.e., I am loved, by my father, represents a feminine attitude, and corresponds to her dominant and manifest sex, according to the theory. Therefore, it ought to escape repression, and there would be no need for its becoming unconscious. But as a matter of fact it does become unconscious, and is replaced by a conscious fantasy which disavows the girl's manifest sexual character. The theory is therefore useless as an explanation of beating fantasies, and is contradicted by the facts. It might be objected that it is precisely in unmanly boys and unwomanly girls that these beating fantasies appeared and went through these vicissitudes, or that it was a trait of femininity in the boy and of masculinity in the girl which must be made responsible for the production of a passive fantasy in the boy, and its repression in the girl. We should be inclined to agree with this view, but it would not be any the less impossible to defend the supposed relation between manifest sexual character and the choice of what is destined for repression. In the last resort, we can only see that both in male and female individuals masculine as well as feminine instinctual impulses are found, and that each can equally well undergo repression and so become unconscious. The theory of the masculine protest seems to maintain its ground very much better on being tested in regard to the beating fantasies. In the case of both boys and girls, the beating fantasy corresponds with a feminine attitude one, that is, in which the individual is lingering on the feminine line and both sexes hasten to get free from this attitude by repressing the fantasy. Nevertheless, it seems to be only with the girl that the masculine protest is attended with complete success, and in that instance, indeed, an ideal example is to be found of the operation of the masculine protest. With the boy the result is not entirely satisfactory, the feminine line is not given up, and the boy is certainly not on top in his conscious masochistic fantasy. It would therefore agree with the expectations derived from the theory if we were to recognize that this fantasy was a symptom which had come into existence through the failure of the masculine protest. It is a disturbing fact, to be sure, that the girl's fantasy, which owes its origin to the forces of repression, also has the value and meaning of a symptom. In this instance, where the masculine protest has completely achieved its object, surely the determining condition for the formation of a symptom must be absent. Before we are led by this difficulty to a suspicion that the whole conception of the masculine protest is inadequate to meet the problem of neuroses and perversions, and that its application to them is unfruitful, we will for a moment leave the passive beating fantasies and turn our attention to other instinctual manifestations of infantile sexual life, manifestations which have equally undergone repression. No one can doubt that there are also wishes and fantasies which keep to the masculine line from their very nature, and which are the expression of masculine instinctual impulses, sadistic tendencies, for instance, or a boy's lustful feelings towards his mother arising out of the normal Oedipus complex. It is no less certain that these impulses, too, are overtaken by repression. If the masculine protest is to be taken as having satisfactorily explained the repression of passive fantasies, which later become masochistic, then it becomes for that very reason totally inapplicable to the opposite case of active fantasies. That is to say, the doctrine of the masculine protest is altogether incompatible with the fact of repression. Unless we are prepared to throw away all that has been acquired in psychology since Brewer's first cathartic treatment and through its agency, we cannot expect that the principle of the masculine protest will acquire any significance in the elucidation of the neuroses and perversions. The theory of psychoanalysis, a theory based on observation, holds firmly to the view that the motive forces of repression must not be sexualized. Man's archaic heritage forms the nucleus of the unconscious mind, and whatever part of that heritage has to be left behind in the advanced to later phases of development, because it is unserviceable or incompatible with what is new and harmful to it, falls a victim to the process of repression. This selection is made more successfully with one group of instincts than with the other. In virtue of special circumstances which have often been pointed out already, one the latter group, that of the sexual instincts, are able to defeat the intentions of repression, and to enforce their representation by substitutive formations of a disturbing kind. For this reason infantile sexuality, which is held under repression, acts as the chief motive force in the formation of symptoms, and the essential part of its content, the Oedipus complex, is the nuclear complex of neuroses. I hope that in this paper I have raised an expectation that the sexual aberrations of childhood, as well as those of mature life, are ramifications of the same complex.